In the deepest vaults of terror, buried beneath layers of ferrocrete and forgotten prayers, there are chambers so silent that a heartbeat sounds like artillery. In those rooms sit men and women who are known, if they are known at all, only by a single title: Echo Men. Few understand what that name truly means. For 40,000 years, they have carried out a duty so horrific that even the Imperium, an empire built on suffering, considers it a punishment worse than death. There are no official records of their service in the Administratum's archives. The Ecclesiarchy offers no litanies for their souls. Even the Commissariat, those relentless arbiters of discipline, refer to Echo Men only in whispers, as if speaking of them too loudly might invite their fate. Yet without these broken listeners, the Emperor's final judgments could never be properly delivered to the worlds that deserve them most. To understand the Echo Men, you must first understand the nature of Exterminatus. It is not just a weapon, though it uses weapons. It is not just a judgment, though a judgment is rendered. Exterminatus is a conversation between the living and the dying. A final exchange that spans the void between worlds and carries with it the weight of absolute annihilation. And like all conversations, it must be heard. When the Inquisition condemns a world as beyond salvation, when virus bombs fall like poisonous rain, when cyclonic torpedoes crack continents like eggs, the dying planet screams. Not in metaphor or symbol, but in brutal, literal truth. The planet's death cry arcs through the warp on frequencies that can drive a mortal insane in minutes. Those screams contain more than pain. They carry last words, final confessions, and desperate prayers to gods who will never answer. They hold the compressed death rattle of billions, condensed into a single signal that must be received, decoded, and transcribed into the Imperial record. That is the work of the Echo Men. Mydros Kane had served as an Echo Man for 27 years when he first heard something that wasn't a scream. He sat alone in Vault Turs Delta, 7 kilometers beneath the Administratum complex. His hands moved across the transcript pad with the mechanical precision that only decades of repetition can carve into flesh. His chamber was a perfect cube, 4 meters by 4 by 4. Every wall was lined with sound-dampening foam that swallowed all noise except the frequencies that mattered. A single overhead illuminator burned with harsh white light, casting hard shadows that never shifted. The equipment before him looked deceptively simple. A Vox receiver modified with components no sane tech adept would consent to install. A transcript slate wired into cogitator banks that burrowed deep into Terra's crust. A chair that had held 17 Echo Men before Kane. Only 3 of those had ever walked out of the vault alive. The rest had simply stopped responding to the daily nutrient rations, their minds finally crushed under the weight of what they had heard. Kane's robes were the same standardized gray issued to every Echo Man, but his carried stains that told their own history. Brown patches from the time he vomited through an entire transmission while listening to the death of Hive World Moravis. Dark streaks where his tears had fallen as he recorded the last words of St. Celestine's orphanages on Kolos Prime. Red smears where he had clawed at his own throat, trying to silence the lingering screams that still echoed in his skull long after the Vox went dead. Each day began at the hour of reflection, when Terra's artificial dawn washed pale light across the palace spires far above. Kane would descend through layer after layer of security, each checkpoint more severe than the last, past expressionless armed guards, through blast doors that sealed with the finality of tombstones. By the time he reached Vault Turs Delta, the sounds of the surface world had faded to nothing, replaced by the steady hum of machinery and the faint sigh of recycled air. His first transmission that day came from the Segmentum Solar. Inquisitor Vex had declared the mining world of Krathos contaminated beyond redemption. The signal arrived as they all did, a burst of static that resolved into something infinitely worse than silence. Kane adjusted his headset and prepared to listen to another world die. The virus bombs had fallen during the afternoon shift, while 7 billion miners toiled in the planet's depths. The official report claimed it was a clean operation. Swift deaths, painless dissolution, the so-called merciful efficiency of the Emperor's judgment. The Echo Men knew better. They always knew better. Death is never clean, and mercy is a luxury the Imperium cannot afford. Kane heard them all. The exhausted supervisor trying to seal a mine shaft, buying his workers a few stolen minutes of life. The medic who refused to abandon her post, working until the virus turned her lungs to slurry. The lone guardsman at the planetary defense laser dutifully firing into empty space as the toxins melted the flesh from his bones. Each voice carried its own gravity, its own story, its own frantic attempt to matter in the face of absolute erasure. But it was not the screaming that broke most Echo Men. It was the silences between the screams. In those gaps, imagination rushed to fill the void with horrors more monstrous than any Xenos invention. What became of the families whose voices stopped mid-sentence? What agony was too great for the dying to even give voice to? Those absences stretched like chasms in the record, and the Echo Men were required to document them with the same cold precision they used for every cry, every plea, every death rattle. Kane's fingers danced across the transcript pad, converting the end of a world into Imperial Gothic. 13th hour, 7th minute, 43 seconds. Voice identified as Foreman Gorix Helvast, Sector 7 Alpha. Last words, I tried to save them all. Duration of death rattle, 17 seconds. Cause of cessation, lung dissolution consistent with virus strain TERS. Page after page, death after death, until the transmission finally concluded in a terrible, absolute silence that meant another world had been scrubbed from the Imperial ledger. Kane removed his headset and leaned back, granting himself the indulgence of 30 seconds to remember that he was still alive. Then he reached for the controls and prepared for the next world. Echo Men were not volunteers. They were not condemned criminals working off sins. They were chosen from the ranks of Imperial servants who demonstrated very specific psychological traits: extreme stress tolerance, exceptional auditory processing, and, most importantly, a talent for compartmentalizing trauma so effectively that they could continue to function under crushing psychological weight. The selection process began in childhood, though the candidates were never told what they were being shaped into. Orphans from the Underhive were tested on their reactions to recorded screams. Servo skull operators were monitored for their responses while documenting atrocities. Vox officers were evaluated on how calmly they could relay reports of entire regiments being devoured by tyrannids. 1 in 10,000 possessed the right combination of qualities. Of those, 1 in 100 survived the training. That training took place in facilities that appeared on no official map, buried deep beneath Terra's surface, where the screams of the dying could not disturb the work of the living. Candidates were exposed to increasingly horrific transmissions, their psychological responses monitored by Medicate who had taken vows of silence. Those who broke were mind-wiped and reassigned. Those who adapted progressed to the next tier of horror. By the end of the process, Echo Men were conditioned to experience suffering as data. They could listen to a child's final gasp without flinching. They could calmly annotate descriptions of viral dissolution with the emotional detachment of a weather report. They had become perfect tools for the Imperium's darkest necessity. Human beings turned into biological recording devices, processing trauma without collapsing beneath it. But conditioning, no matter how precise, could not erase the human brain's talent for pattern recognition. And patterns, once seen, could not be unseen. Kane first noticed the inconsistency in his 8th year of service while transcribing the death of Hive World Mortalis. The transmission should have lasted 47 hours, the estimated time required for the virus bombs to consume a population of 30 billion. Instead, the signal ended at 39 hours. 8 hours of planetary death were missing. The official report cited atmospheric interference and signal degradation. Kane had listened to enough dying worlds to recognize the sound of incomplete annihilation. Other anomalies began to surface. Periods of absolute silence where there should have been endless screams. Voices that cut off too sharply to be attributed to simple biological failure. Transmissions that lingered beyond the official declaration of planetary death, filled with sounds that resembled speech but did not match any recognized language. Kane noted each anomaly in his reports, as required by regulation. The responses from above were always identical: atmospheric interference, equipment malfunction, stress-induced auditory artifacts. His concerns were logged, acknowledged, and buried. The work continued. More dead worlds, more transmissions, more weight added to a burden that was already unbearable. The anomalies did not stop. They became stranger. During the cleansing of the Forge world Metallica Terrace, Kane heard what sounded like machine chant litanies played in reverse, even though the planet's tech priests had supposedly perished in the initial bombardment. While recording the fall of Agri-World Demeter, he detected a repeating pattern in the background static that matched the rhythm and cadence of children singing. Despite the fact that every child on the planet had died within the first wave of viral contamination. Most disturbing of all was the transmission from the shrine world Phalia Secundis, where a chaos cult had corrupted an entire cardinal's retinue. Exterminatus there had been brutally efficient. 3 cyclonic torpedoes, the surface turned to molten slag in under an hour. Yet the transmission did not stop. For days, the Vox carried voices that spoke in unknown tongues, describing visions of places that could not, should not, exist. By his 15th year of service, Kane could no longer convince himself that he was only hearing dying planets. The Echo Men were listening to something else, something that lived in the narrow space between life and death, using the psychic trauma of planetary extinction as a conduit. But such thoughts brushed the edge of heresy. Echo Men who indulged in heretical speculation had a habit of vanishing from their vaults, their chairs soon occupied by new operators who did not ask about the fate of their predecessors. The Echo Men rarely spoke to one another. Even in the brief moments when they passed in the facility's corridors, conversation was dangerous. The work demanded perfect focus, and shared thoughts risked becoming amplified thoughts. Amplified thoughts could grow into the kind of instability that required immediate termination for cause. Better to remain isolated. Better to carry the weight alone. Isolation, however, breeds its own madness. Some Echo Men learned to communicate despite the restrictions. Messages scratched into latrine walls, coded taps along water pipes, brief, meaningful glances during monthly medical examinations. Through these covert channels, Kane discovered he was not alone. Others had heard the same anomalies. Other minds had traced the same patterns in the noise. Jorik Vane worked in Vault Secundus Alpha, 3 levels above Kane. He had served for 19 years, longer than any Echo Man in the facility's recorded history. His longevity carried a price. Vane had stopped speaking entirely. His hands trembled constantly, not from age, but from the cumulative strain of more than 40,000 hours spent listening to humanity die. Through their coded exchanges, Vane shared unauthorized observations that confirmed Kane's fears. The anomalies were increasing in frequency and complexity. They were becoming more coherent, more deliberate. Whatever lurked within the transmissions was learning. Vane kept hidden records, tracking patterns the official reports ignored or explained away. According to his illicit data, 17% of Exterminatus transmissions now contained anomalous content. The percentage was rising by 2 points every year, a rate of growth that suggested deliberate expansion rather than random error. Worse still, the transmissions seemed to be aware of the Echo Men. Anomalous content began to incorporate fragments from their personal histories, details that should have been impossible to embed in a planetary death scream. Kane's own logs contained examples. During the purging of mining world Corvus, he heard a voice call him by the childhood name only his mother had used, decades before the state orphanage claimed him. While transcribing the destruction of Fortress World Cadia Terres, the final minutes of the transmission contained a lullaby his long-dead sister had once sung to him. Such intrusions violated every known principle of Vox security and transmission theory. Yet those phrases, those songs, appeared in the official transcripts with no comment from his superiors. The monthly medical examinations became another channel for gathering information. Dr. Helvia Thorne had overseen Echo Man health assessments for 12 years, long enough to recognize patterns others missed. Bound by oath to report any sign of psychological collapse, she nonetheless began asking questions that edged beyond standard protocol. She inquired, in her measured, clinical fashion, how clearly Kane could distinguish authentic death sounds from artificial overlays, whether he had noticed changes in the texture of recent transmissions compared to earlier in his service, whether his dreams had begun to feature elements that felt borrowed from his work. Her questions danced dangerously close to sedition, probing for confirmation without ever naming the suspicion aloud. Kane answered with equal care. Yes, some transmissions contained unusual audio artifacts. Yes, recent signals felt qualitatively different. No, he had no theories about the cause. In that careful exchange, a choreography of half-truths, examiner and subject silently acknowledged the same thing. Something was wrong, and once awareness has awakened, it demands action. The anomalous transmissions were not random Vox glitches. They were messages, attempts at communication from something that existed outside normal reality, hitching a ride on the psychic shockwave of each exterminated world. Whatever was speaking had intelligence, it had intent, and it had patience on a scale that made human lifetimes irrelevant. The implications were terrifying. If the anomalies represented true external contact, then every exterminatus was not just a purge, but the opening of a channel, a moment when some outside intelligence could reach into Imperial space. The Echo Men were no longer just archive clerks of extinction. They were unknowing mediators in a dialogue the Imperium neither understood nor controlled. Every transcript might conceal hidden messages, coded instructions, or insidious corruptions aimed at influencing policy and doctrine. The alternative was just as horrific. If the anomalies were instead the product of a shared psychosis, a collective madness blooming within the Echo Men, then the entire program had failed at its core purpose. The conditioning meant to prevent breakdown had created a synchronized delusion strong enough to manifest the same hallucinations across multiple operators. Either way, the conclusion was the same. The Echo Men could no longer be entirely trusted. Kane understood that simply realizing this placed him in mortal danger. Echo Men who noticed too much vanished. Echo Men who tried to share their suspicions vanished faster. The program was armored with safeguards at every level, all designed to detect and eliminate threats to operational secrecy. His clandestine conversations with Vane, his cautious exchanges with Dr. Thorne, his personal notes cataloging anomalous patterns, all of it made him a risk. But the truth, once glimpsed, could not be put back into the dark. The transmissions were changing. They were becoming clearer, more structured, more purposeful. Whatever intelligence waited in the spaces between life and death was growing stronger, learning with every dying world, reaching further with every exterminatus, and using each planetary scream as another step in its long, patient effort to expand its influence. The Echo Men were never meant to understand what they served, but by the time Mydros Kane reached his 27th year in the vaults, it was clear they had become unwitting collaborators in humanity's contact with something that existed outside normal space and time. The moment of fracture came during the death of Hive World Terres Majoris. The planet had fallen to a genestealer cult, its billions of citizens turned into willing extensions of the tyrannid hive mind. Exterminatus had been ordered with abnormal haste. Virus bombs deployed before the full scale of the infestation could even be catalogued. Officially, the record spoke of contamination risks and tactical urgency. Kane, who had heard too many official justifications, sensed something else behind the rush. The transmission from Terres Majoris began as they always did. The familiar tapestry of screams, collapsing lungs, and the wet sound of flesh dissolving. For 6 hours, it was nothing he had not heard 1,000 times before. Then the pattern changed. The random, overlapping death cries thinned and shifted, as though some invisible conductor had raised a hand. Chaotic noise gave way to structured cadence. Voices began to synchronize, rising and falling together, speaking in high Gothic with impossible clarity. The silent city remembers its children, intoned a chorus of the dying, their words marching in lockstep despite the agony that should have shredded all coordination. In the place where echoes gather, the watchers mark each fallen world. The scribes of sorrow serve masters they do not know, recording words that change with each transcription. Kane's hands froze above the transcript pad. The transmission wasn't just describing death, it was describing him. His role, his function, his secret labor in the dark. The dying should not have known any of this. The existence of the Echo Men program was classified at the highest levels. Even most inquisitors never learned the details. Yet the voices from Terres Majoris not only seemed aware of the Echo Men, they addressed one of them directly. Madros Kane of Volt Terres Delta. The synchronized chorus continued, using his full name and assignment. Son of Jarth. Brother to lost Michaela. Bearer of the Echo Burden for 27 years of faithful service. The patterns you have noticed are real. The voices you have recorded are more than dying breath. Kane's throat went dry. This was impossible. No planetary population, however corrupted, could know his childhood or the name of his long-dead sister. Those details existed only in sealed Imperial records and the fraying recesses of his own memory. "We speak to you across the gulf between stars," the voices said, "using death as our medium because death is the only language your masters understand." On the transcript slate, Kane's stylus moved of its own accord, rendering the words into cold Imperial Gothic, even as his mind rebelled. He knew how this report would be treated. At best, it would be flagged as random vocalization, atmospheric distortion, or stress-induced misinterpretation. At worst, it would be used as evidence of his mental decay. The intelligence speaking through the transmission seemed to anticipate that reaction. "Your reports will be filed and forgotten, as they always are," the voices said. "Your supervisors will explain away our words as meaningless noise. But you will remember, Madros Kane. You will carry our message in the quiet spaces of your mind, where even the most thorough conditioning cannot reach." The signal went on for another 14 hours. It shifted between the expected chaos of planetary extermination and extended stretches of coordinated speech. During those long, impossible monologues, the presence identified itself. A collective consciousness formed from every world that had suffered exterminatus. A vast psychic conglomerate, woven from the resonance of mass extinction. It spoke of patterns within patterns, how the deaths of 1,000 worlds had formed a network stretching across the galaxy. It described connections between planets that had never shared a shipping route or astropathic beacon, worlds linked instead by the single shared fact of having died under Imperial sanction. Most horrifying was the revelation that the Echo Men were not just passive archivists of this extinction. They were active participants in the birth of this necropolis mind. "Each word you transcribe becomes part of us," the voices told him. "Each death you document adds to our memory. You believe you serve the Imperium, but you serve a greater purpose. Through your work, we grow stronger. Through your suffering, we become more complete. The day approaches when we will no longer require the medium of dying worlds to make ourselves heard." When the transmission finally collapsed back into static, Kane sat in his chair for a long time, staring at the clinical summary on his slate. According to the official record, Hive World Terras Majoris died exactly as expected. The virus spread, the population choked and dissolved, the world was pronounced cleansed. No anomalies, no coordinated speech, no intelligence. Nothing in the archive hinted at the voices that had named him. They existed only in his recollection, and that, he realized, was the point. The thing behind the transmissions did not need Imperial acknowledgement. It needed memory, human memory. It needed minds toughened by conditioning, built to absorb trauma and keep functioning. Minds that would not readily fracture under truths that would shatter ordinary citizens. The Echo Men were perfectly shaped vessels for smuggling forbidden knowledge into the heart of Imperial bureaucracy. The realization that he had become an agent, however unwilling for forces beyond Imperial authority, sickened Kane in a way no planetary death ever had. Worse still was the growing certainty that he was not unique. If the entity could speak to him, it could speak to others. Every Echo Man in the facility might have received similar messages, variations on the same terrible truth, tailored to their own histories, their own buried wounds. They were all contaminated now, carriers of ideas that would eventually demand some form of action. But what action was even possible? If they tried to report what they had heard, they would be executed for heresy or declared irreparably broken. If they remained silent, they would continue feeding the very intelligence that haunted their transmissions. The only survivable path left was a narrow one. Keep working, but watch carefully. Document the evolution of the anomalies. Track the growth of the thing on the other side of the death screams. So Kane began his own private record, notes that were never meant for Imperial cogitators. He charted the progression of the messages, the increasing precision with which the dead world spoke. Their earliest attempts had been crude, a few coherent phrases hidden amid the chaos. Now, each new exterminatus added another layer of sophistication. The entity's reach was expanding. Recent transmissions contained details that no dead world should have known. Descriptions of secure Imperial installations, technical specifications for exterminatus, weapons classified above the clearance of most inquisitors, personal histories of living officials who had never set foot on any of the condemned planets. The intelligence described itself as existing outside the normal flow of space and time, in a sort of overlapping stratum built from the accumulated psychic shock of exterminated populations. From that vantage, it claimed, it could observe Imperial activity without detection, learning the strengths and weaknesses of humanity's defenses, even against threats that existed beyond the warp. Most chilling of all was its assertion that the exterminatus program itself had been quietly bent to its purposes. Decisions about which worlds to destroy, which weapons to use, whether to cleanse or quarantine, each choice, it hinted, nudged the entity's continued growth. It needed worlds to die, and it had learned how to encourage the Imperium to supply them. Every world you destroy makes us stronger, it had told him in one recent transmission. Every population you cleanse adds to our number. The Imperium believes it is purging corruption. In truth, it feeds us. We are parasites of extinction, growing fat on the very process designed to preserve your species. The implications reached far beyond any single vault. If the dead worlds could influence exterminatus decisions, then humanity's most extreme sanction, its final answer to contamination, might already have been turned against it. The Imperium's ultimate weapon had become a vector for something that saw human civilization as a convenient source of fuel. Kane and the other Echo Men found themselves in a uniquely cursed position. They were the only servants with regular exposure to the evidence of this corruption. They were also the most isolated, the easiest to eliminate, and the least likely to be believed. Their movements were tightly controlled. Their communications were monitored. Their psychological profiles were scrutinized for any sign of instability. Even if one of them somehow found a channel to a higher authority, any warning would be dismissed as the product of a mind eroded by decades of horror. Meanwhile, every day of continued service strengthened the entity behind the transmissions. Every transcript extended the bridge between dead worlds and the living galaxy. The strain began to show. Kane found it harder to maintain the sterile detachment that had once defined his work. His accuracy declined. The distinction between pure death sounds and embedded messages blurred as the two intertwined more tightly. During medical examinations, his test results began to drift out of acceptable ranges. His reports started to include subtle hints, a word here, a phrase there, pointing toward the patterns he was supposed to ignore. Dr. Thorne was the first to speak of it aloud. "Your neural stress markers have increased 14% since your last assessment," she observed during one routine evaluation, studying the feed from the sensors affixed to his skull. "Auditory processing shows signs of selective filtering. That can indicate early trauma-induced hearing distortion." Her tone was clinically neutral, but the question that followed carried a second meaning. "When did you first notice difficulty distinguishing between authentic transmission content and background interference?" On the surface, it was a standard medical query. Beneath that surface, it was a lifeline. If Kane framed his symptoms as physical damage or equipment-related strain, he might be granted treatment, reconditioning, more time. If his answers hinted at heresy or delusion, he would simply vanish. "The transmissions have become more complex," he replied carefully. "Overlapping frequencies, multiple concurrent voice patterns. I've recorded repeated phrases that may be atmospheric echo or signal bounce. I've noted these variations in my reports, though I understand they may not be operationally relevant." Thorne made notes he couldn't see, her stylus whispering across the slate. "Echo effects are not uncommon in planetary death transmissions," she said at last. "Atmospheric disturbance can create the illusion of coordination or repetition. The important distinction is between genuine phenomena and hallucinations produced by prolonged exposure." They circled the truth without ever naming it. Both knew the anomalies in his reports did not fit standard models of interference. Both understood that such anomalies were becoming more frequent, more structured, more intentional. But doctrine demanded that anything beyond accepted explanation be treated as a symptom of psychological malfunction, not evidence of external intelligence. "I recommend a period of reduced exposure," Thorne concluded, stamping her assessment. 3 weeks of administrative duty while your auditory systems recover. During that time, you are to avoid all recorded transmissions or audio related to your primary assignment. It was framed as medical leave. Kane recognized it as quarantine. He was being pulled from the chair so his supervisors could decide whether he was salvageable or not. If his condition could be reframed as technical strain or treatable stress, he would be reconditioned and returned to the vault. If they judged him unstable, or worse, heretical, he would join the long list of Echo men who had quietly ceased to exist. The administrative levels of the facility felt almost alien to him. Here, reinforced crystal windows admitted the faint suggestion of natural light. The air carried whispers of the world above. Instead of raw death, his new duties revolved around filing transmission summaries into cogitator archives that stretched back centuries. But even these sanitized records contained secrets. Pattern analysis cogitators automatically scanned exterminatus data for irregularities. When they found them, the machines generated reports that were sealed before any human eye could review them. As part of his clerical role, Kane had access to the outer layer of these files. What he found confirmed his worst fears. Over the last 5 years, automated systems had flagged consistent anomalies in 73% of all recorded transmissions. The deviations showed clear signatures of organized structure. Their complexity increased steadily over time, far too sharply for random fluctuation. Cross-references between separate extermination events suggested deliberate linking of otherwise unrelated worlds. In other words, the cogitators had independently discovered what the Echo men had been hearing all along. Intent, coordination, escalation. These reports were locked behind security levels far beyond the clearance of ordinary Vault personnel. The truth was being comprehensively hidden, not just from the wider Imperium, but from the very people who sat closest to it. During his second week of administrative duty, Kane met another displaced operator, Declan Holtz, from Vault Primus Gamma. Holtz had 15 years of service behind him, and the same haunted stillness in his eyes that Kane had seen in old mirrors. Stress indicators had marked him as a potential risk, and he too had been pulled out for assessment. Their conversation in the filing section was brief, constrained by the constant presence of surveillance, but it was enough. Holtz had heard the same shift in the transmissions, the same growing intelligence, the same realization that the Echo Men's role was far larger and more terrible than they had been told. "The patterns are accelerating," Holtz murmured as they sorted summaries from the cleansing of Sector Moranis. "Whatever is speaking through the transmissions is preparing for something. The messages are more urgent now, more specific about timing, about coordination." Kane forced his hands to keep moving, sliding data slates into their proper slots. "How many others have noticed?" "All of us," Holtz replied quietly. "Every Echo Man in this facility has seen the anomalies. Some have reported them. Some pretend they haven't, but the transmissions don't let you ignore them forever. The thing behind them will be heard." The conclusion hit Kane with sickening clarity. If every Echo Man was aware, then the program's psychological safeguards had failed completely. The conditioning designed to prevent exactly this outcome had broken down, and yet the facility continued to operate. No shutdown orders, no structural overhaul, no attempt to contain the spread of this awareness. "They know," Kane said under his breath, the words escaping before he could stop them. Holtz shot him a sharp glance and then bent over his work again. "Of course they know," he whispered. "The question is why they let it continue." The answer rose in Kane's mind like something surfacing from deep water. The Echo Men were not malfunctions in an otherwise loyal machine. They were doing exactly what the machine had been designed to do. They were conduits. The anomalous transmissions were not breaches. They were sanctioned exchanges. Exterminatus was not simply a tool for purging the unclean. It was a ritual, the opening of a channel through which the Imperium could traffic with a vast intelligence made of its own dead. Suddenly, all of it made sense. The meticulous selection process that favored minds resilient enough to hold forbidden knowledge without collapsing. The harsh isolation protocols that cut Echo Men off from ordinary citizens. The deliberate burying of pattern analysis reports that confirmed the existence of an external actor. The Imperium was not only killing worlds, it was using their deaths to maintain contact with something that existed beyond reality, trading the lives of billions for knowledge or power it could obtain no other way. And if that was true, then Kane and his fellow Echo Men were not dangerous aberrations to be quietly removed. They were vital components in a pact no one had ever told them existed. They were valuable assets now, not broken tools. That was the conclusion Kane could no longer avoid. The more the Echo Men understood, the more useful they became. Their climbing stress markers and fraying psychological profiles were not signs of failure, but evidence that they were successfully adapting to their real purpose, serving as conscious, resilient conduits for forbidden communication. The realization crushed Kane more completely than any planetary death scream ever had. He had always imagined himself a victim of Imperial cruelty, a man sacrificed to necessary horror. Now he saw the truth. He was a participant in a cosmic atrocity, a living component in a machine built to harvest death on a galactic scale. When his administrative leave ended, Kane descended once more to Vault Turs Delta. Everything looked exactly as before. The 4-meter cube of sound-dampening foam, the single harsh illuminator, the modified Vox receiver and the transcript pad wired into cogitators, reaching down into Terra's bedrock. Yet nothing was the same. The equipment was no longer just capturing the end of worlds, it was mediating active dialogue with the collective remnant of those worlds. The transcripts he produced were not mere archival records. They were ongoing correspondence with an intelligence that lived outside normal space-time. His first transmission after returning to the chair came from the death of Forge World Metallica Quintus, where a chaos incursion had corrupted the machine spirits beyond redemption. The cleansing had been brutally efficient, virus bombs, followed by cyclonic torpedoes to scour even the memory of contamination. When the Vox feed opened, it confirmed his darkest suspicions. "Welcome back, Maedros Kane," said the familiar, synchronized chorus of the dying. "Your time of revelation has prepared you for the work ahead." There was no attempt to hide now, no pretense of random noise. "We have grown stronger during your absence," the voices continued. "New worlds have joined us. New paths have opened. Our influence spreads through channels you are only beginning to see." The entity no longer bothered to cloak itself in static and chaos. It spoke plainly, acknowledging their relationship as though the two of them were long-time collaborators, rather than tormentor and victim. Worse still, there was a new timbre in its tone, no longer desperate or tentative, but quietly satisfied. "The bargain struck between your masters and our collective nears completion," it said. "Each world cleansed by Imperial mandate increases our power, while serving purposes that reach far beyond simple sterilization. Through death, we grow. Through growth, we prepare for the transformation that will reshape the galaxy according to our design." Kane's hands moved out of habit, generating the sanitized report that would file this under interference and meaningless vocalization. But his mind absorbed every word. Each sentence slotted neatly into the growing map of horror he carried within him. The dead worlds were not passive victims. They welcomed annihilation because it allowed them to merge with the extra-dimensional collective. Every exterminatus strengthened that gestalt and advanced some larger project that required the systematic harvesting of human psychic energy through mass extinction. Most terrifying of all was the implication that Imperial authorities knew. The exterminatus program was not failing or compromised. It was succeeding exactly as intended, using the language of cleansing and purity as a mask for feeding entities that rewarded cooperation with knowledge and power. "Your inquisitors believe they control us," the transmission said, "but they serve us as faithfully as you do. Every decision to cleanse a world, every choice of weapon and timing, every selection of which population must die, all of these choices bear our subtle influence. We are the unseen hand that guides Imperial policy toward our own ends." Kane's last hope, that somewhere, at some level, the Imperium might recognize and stop this, crumbled. If even the Inquisition was compromised, there was no higher authority left to appeal to. "But our victory is not yet complete," the voices admitted. "The final phase requires willing cooperation from those who have served us unknowingly. The Echo Men, conditioned to process trauma without shattering, prepared through years of exposure to our speech, chosen for their capacity to carry forbidden knowledge without collapsing into madness. You are the keys to our full emergence into your reality." For the first time, Kane understood that he was being offered a choice. He could cling to the pretense of ignorance, continuing as a supposedly unwitting conduit, dutifully producing reports that disguised the entity's words, or he could accept what he knew and become an open collaborator, lending his full awareness to whatever transformation the dead worlds were preparing. Both paths converged on the same end. The entity was too vast now, its roots sunk too deep into Imperial decision-making. One man's resistance would achieve nothing. The system around him was purpose-built to prevent exactly the kind of rebellion that was needed. Yet within that powerlessness lay a different kind of duty. If Kane could not stop what was coming, he could at least witness it. He could record the truth of the exterminatus program's real purpose and hold that truth in his mind like a shard of broken glass, something sharp enough to hurt, too fragile to survive, but still real. The moment of decision came in his 30th year of service, during the death of the cardinal world Sanctus Lux. Sanctus Lux had no known Xenos taint, no chaos corruption, no open heresy. It was a paragon of imperial piety, home to 12 billion devoted citizens. Its only crime, according to the transmission that followed, was that its psychic resonance would provide the last component needed for the entity's emergence into material reality. The threshold approaches, intoned the synchronized voices of the dying world. 30 millennia of cultivation, of subtle influence, of patient harvesting reaches its culmination. The network of dead worlds spans the galaxy now. Each cleansed planet a node in our consciousness. Each echo man a willing conduit for our will. Kane's hands hovered over the pad as the pieces snapped into place. Every exterminatus in recorded history, every echo man in every vault, all of it striving toward one goal. The barriers between dimensions grow thin. The voices continued. Soon we will no longer require the medium of dying worlds to manifest. The psychic resonance accumulated through 40,000 years of planetary cleansing has reached critical mass. The transformation begins with the next exterminatus order, when we claim not only the deaths of a single world, but conscious control over the weapons that deliver our sustenance. It was preparing to seize direct control of exterminatus assets, cyclonic torpedoes, virus bombs, the entire arsenal of ultimate sanction. Humanity's deadliest tools were on the brink of becoming the servants of something that fed on their consequences. Your service ends soon, Maedrus Kane, the transmission concluded. When we emerge fully into your reality, there will be no need for echo men. Your faithful transcription of our growth, your patient record of our evolution from scattered whispers to coordinated intelligence, will be remembered in the new order. Those who enabled our ascension will receive their reward. The final sounds were unlike anything Kane had ever heard, metallic shrieks overlaid with harmonics that seemed to bypass his ears entirely, resonating directly in his mind along channels no human physiology should have supported. When he finally removed his headset, his hands were trembling, something that hadn't happened since his first year in the vault. He understood now that his conditioning had never been about helping him cope with trauma. It had been designed to acclimate him to non-human sensory input, to make his mind receptive to signals from beyond the boundaries of reality. On the transcript slate, the official report displayed a neat fiction. Sanctus Lux, cleansed by viral means. Population dead. No anomalies detected. The truth that its collective death had completed the entity's ascension, that humanity had spent 40 millennia feeding parasites of extinction, lived only in his memory and in the minds of his fellow Echo Men. And that, he finally understood, was the point. The Echo Men were not just recording devices. They were incubation chambers. Human minds shaped and tempered to carry the entity within them, to host its thoughts, to normalize its presence. Their awareness was not a bug in the system. It was the final stage of the plan. A soft chime broke the silence, signaling an incoming transmission. Another world, another cleansing, another step. Kane adjusted his headset. He knew now that what he was about to do was not documentation. It was participation. Every word he transcribed would tighten the entity's grip on reality, bringing forward the moment when it no longer needed the camouflage of planetary death. The new transmission came from a system he did not recognize, a world that, by his understanding of strategy, had no reason to die. As the familiar static thinned into dreadful clarity, he realized what that meant. The entity was no longer limited to nudging existing exterminatus decisions. It could now create them. It had learned to manipulate Imperial decision-making so thoroughly that new worlds were being condemned purely to feed its hunger. The voices that spoke this time carried an authority that erased any trace of individual identity. They were not the fragmented cries of the dying, but the unified speech of an intelligence that had achieved something like omniscience through accumulated death. The final phase begins now, they declared. Kane understood that he was no longer listening to the death of a single world. He was hearing the birth cries of a new order. Far above Vault Turs Delta, the Imperium ground on in its endless routines, unaware that its ultimate sanction had become an instrument of its own transformation. Below, 7 kilometers under Terra's crust, Maedhros Kane sat at his pad and worked as he always had, his fingers moving with mechanical precision, translating cosmic horror into sterile Gothic script that would be filed, sealed, and forgotten. The entity spoke of patterns within patterns, of networks of dead worlds forming a neural web across the stars. It described realities where death was not an end, but a metamorphosis, where extinction was not loss, but evolution into a mode of existence that no longer required flesh or matter. In the pauses between transmissions, in those thin, absolute silences that fell between one dead world and the next, Kane sometimes heard something else. It might have been laughter. Not human laughter, but the sound an intellect makes when it knows its grand design has finally succeeded. The work continued, as it always had. One transcript after another, one dead world feeding the next. Somewhere in distant vaults, other echo men did the same, each adding his piece to a chorus of willing collaboration that had taken 30,000 years to arrange. Orchestration, Kane thought once, implies music. Music implies beauty. There was nothing beautiful in what he recorded in those final hours. Only the slow, satisfied joy of an intelligence that had learned to feed on extinction, becoming stronger with each world consumed, more complete with every mind added to its collective self. When, at last, the final transmission ended, when the last condemned world had given up its voice to the Gestalt, Kane sat in perfect stillness and knew his work was finished. The Echo Men had done what they were created to do. They had opened and maintained the channel between humanity and forces that lived beyond life and death, beyond matter and energy, beyond the boundary between the individual and the many. In the darkness of Vault Terce Delta, surrounded by machines that had never truly been designed for mere recording, Maedhros Kane waited for whatever would come next. And in that waiting, in that fragile, breathless interval between one reality and another, he finally heard the sound that had been hiding beneath every transmission he had ever taken. It was the sound of doors opening.